That's very loud. I don't think, do you need me to, is this okay? You need it for back there. Yeah. Okay. Is there a way we can lower this a bit? Because I feel like I should be auctioning something. And it's too early for that. All right, that's better. Thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's a beautiful view. I've never been in this room before, but wow, today, if there's a swarm of bats that come towards us, that was not part of the planned simulation. So I'm the Director of Pedagogical Innovation at the Safra Center. I'm also a full-time ethicist at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I've been doing that for many years now. Before that, I got my PhD in philosophy at MIT. And what I want to do with this first morning session is talk a little bit about some of the ways that we will be using simulations for ethical learning. But before we jump to that, I just want to build off of what Michael said about this whole week in general. So the Safra Center for Ethics has always been devoted to improving ethics education, both in the yard and across the professional schools, the graduate schools as well. It's always had that as one of its preoccupations, and with a special focus on thinking about practical ethics and the way that ethics can be embedded in professional settings. Due to the generosity of the Safra family a few years ago, we were able to build up this arm of the Safra Center and appoint me as Director of Pedagogical Innovation and bring in a wonderful team of Ethics Pedagogy Fellows. And so this team has consisted of 4 persons each year, and they have been tasked with doing several things. One of the things that they have helped us do and continue to help us do is to work and collaborate with faculty who are interested in either designing a new ethics course or on changing, improving, re-envisioning an existing ethics course and then delivering it either in the yard or at a professional school. We've been really focused on helping faculty put together new and exciting Gen Ed ethics and civics courses. So as you may already know, Gen Ed is relaunching, and it's relaunching in the fall. And there's now a portion of it that is ethics and civics devoted. And they have a certain idea about the way that these courses should go. A lot of faculty are interested in bringing new courses into it or taking courses that they've already gotten and remodeling them. And the Ethics Pedagogy Fellows have been a tremendous resource for us in helping faculty do that. But that's not the only thing that they do. Indeed, as we've come to know them, they are so fantastically gifted in thinking about the delivery of ethics education in very many venues here at the university and elsewhere. And so one of the projects that we wanted them to do over the course of this entire year was to diagnose an area that they felt could use an interesting intervention, and then to put together what that intervention would look like. And so this week, today and Thursday and then Monday, what you're going to see, what we're going to be showcasing is the work that they've done in that space, thinking about an area that can be improved when it comes to ethics education, broadly conceived, and then presenting to you their work in progress on how they're thinking about addressing that issue. So I'm very excited to be a part of having overseen this, and I'm very excited for you for a chance to get a sense of what they've been up to. What I'm going to do is talk to you about my own ethics intervention for the next couple of hours. So some of you are already familiar with this or with my work, but if you're not, one of the things that I've been devoted to over several years is bringing simulated active learning exercises into ethics education. And what I'm going to do for about 10, 15 minutes is just talk to you a little bit about that broadly. But in the spirit of active learning exercises, talking about it is not nearly as interesting as doing it. And so we're going to be doing a little bit as well. We're going to be going through what one of these things looks like. So the first thing I'll point to is I'm very excited to share that my thinking on this subject has now seen print. So my colleague and friend Tomer Perry and I have just recently had a paper of ours published in the Journal of Political Science Education that lays out what we think you can do in terms of teaching ethics through simulations. And it sort of gives our general approach to this. And it's nice because it's the first paper in this space, and so we're happy to have anchored the discussion going forward. One of the things that we mention repeatedly in that paper is that we aren't approaching the use of simulations in teaching ethics as a competition with more traditional ways of teaching ethics. It's meant to complement the way that ethics is taught. It's not meant to replace it or compete with it. So we envision ethics simulation being embedded in a course that has plenty of lecturing, plenty of the Socratic method, plenty of old school thought experiments, and cases. But we also think that there is something that is missing once you do all of that as well, and that's what we hope the simulations solve. And we introduce some research to suggest that that's indeed the case. Anecdotally, I'll tell you what drew me to thinking about simulations was the following sort of thing. And I'm glad that Arthur's here. Arthur's also taught, with cases at the Kennedy School, and we get this on a regular basis. You'll introduce a case to students at a policy school where, say, there will be a protagonist, and this protagonist will be wrestling with hard, moral trade-offs about how do I do this or that? Here's my professional role. Here's, my obligations to my own morality, et cetera, et cetera. And you've got this rich case, and students will engage it, and they'll see how ethics lives in the practical arena. But then they'll almost always, perhaps irresistibly, imagine themselves in the most heroic way when thinking about what they would have done in the exact same situation. Well, I never would have made this mistake that the protagonist had made, or I never would have made this trade-off, or I would never, if I was just smart enough, I would figure out a way to get all the ethical goods that I would want to get. I'd never have to make a decision that traded off one principle with another. I'd always just get it. And no matter how hard you try to frame these sorts of conversations, inevitably I found, and perhaps this is a failure of my own teaching, but inevitably I found that students would leave with a sense that it was terribly interesting to learn about this protagonist, and yes, we were able to draw some interesting general moral lessons from it, but the students will think, well, I won't ever face quite something like this, because if I did, I'd be able to think my way into a position where I would come out in a much different spot. And after doing this for years and years and getting this result, I said to myself, you know what, I don't believe you. And so I'd rather see what you actually do rather than hypothesizing what you do. So the spirit of some of these simulations is to put people in a simulated experience where rather than them hypothesizing what they would do when it comes to hard moral choices, they're actually asked to make hard moral choices. And they're asked to live with the results of those choices. So I introduce typically, though not exclusively, some randomization component that captures the fact that these decisions, as are decisions in the real world, are made under conditions of uncertainty. So you just never know exactly what's going to happen. You try your best, you see what happens, you absorb that consequence, and you move on. And that's what inspired me to start doing simulations in the first place. What we've come to learn is that students really appreciate them for a couple of different reasons. One, they themselves don't want it to replace other sorts of learning in the classroom when it comes to ethics, but they enjoy the fact that they get to put into practice and learn about themselves some of the principles that they're learning in a more traditional fashion. So they'll say, for instance, and you get this regularly, I thought I was a consequentialist. I thought I was the sort of person who only cared about the consequences of things. And then they'll point at me, Robichaud, you put me in this situation, and it was a clear path in front of me that the consequentialist would have taken, and I didn't do that in this case. And now I have to think about why I didn't do that. Or we'll ask them, hey, rank your values. Just off the top of your head, what are the things that you value, and how important are they? Or you rank your values. And then they'll be in a simulation and they'll say, I can't believe this. I thought that honesty was one of the most important things to me, but I found myself quite happy to engage in deceitful behavior when it came to pursuing this end. There's a stickiness that comes out of ethical simulations that students remember the kind of learning that they had around it. And so I will have them come to me, and we're seeing some research to suggest that this lasts for quite a while. They'll come to me afterwards. I've had students during graduation, or a simulation I ran in the summer before they even got to the Kennedy School. In graduation, shake my hand, thank you, Professor Robichaud. I'm still thinking about that thing that I did. And firstly, I tell them, it's maybe time to let go. You've got a cap, you've got a cap and gown on. I've let go. Maybe it's time for you to let go as well. But the point is, they still keep coming back to it. So I think that there's a rich arena in which strategic insertions of simulations can really help and complement more traditional kinds of ethical learning. Challenges with it include some of the following. You don't want to overdo them because then students do not have an opportunity to interrogate ideas and look at arguments and engage in reasoning and the other sorts of things that we value. So they have to complement rather than compete with what I think are other really good forms of ethics education. And there's a real sweet spot we've come to learn between a simulation in which is rich in learning and a simulation in which students feel that it was too distant from them to sink their teeth into. I'm going to introduce a simulation for you this afternoon or this morning that's a little bit crazy. And you may think that the craziness of it gets people to think, no, I can't get a purchase on it. But that's not usually what does it. It's other things. In fact, the more fictional you can get in times, the easier students are to take up the fiction. Because the more realistic we try to make a simulation, some people who live in that space will say it wasn't realistic enough for them. For instance, we have a campaign simulation that works wonderfully for people that have never worked on a campaign. But then you always get the one or two people who worked on the campaign, they're like, but there's like all this more complexity, to which the response is, yes, indeed, there's all this more complexity. But that's not particularly helpful for the decisions here. So there's ongoing work in progress on figuring out how to do this. All right, with that all said, let me tell you some features of many of the simulations I've designed very briefly, where we're at, and then we're going to roll out a simulation. Most of the simulations I design, the one you'll be going through today, and the one that we write about in the paper, are simulations in which individuals are given a fictional role. Hey, you're a campaign manager, or you're an ethics board of a hospital, or you're in the inner circle of the president, these sorts of things. So the role is fictional. But they are asked to be themselves in the simulation. And by that I mean they're not asked to take on a whole new ethics, but to rather learn what they would do in these sorts of scenarios. And so it builds on the fact that you can't hide once you've made these decisions and say, well, look, I was just taking on a fictional personality and a fictional ethic. No, one of the central features is, for many of these, that you take on your own person. You're your own person in a fictional role. However, there are some exceptions to that. I am not rolling this one out today, even though I think it's a fascinating simulation, just because it's intense and it would require more hours than we have. But just this past 16 months or so, I collaborated with my colleague at the Kennedy School, Brian Mandel, on designing a simulation in the space of civil disagreement. And so this came to us because students said, we really want some practice engaging in really hard public conversations. And the argument went from some students, we're not getting that in the day-to-day conversations that we're having amongst ourselves. And so we want sort of an arena created in which we can have hard conversations that we're not having ourselves. All right, so that's a task that's given to us. So we built an exercise that was part of a program. So there was still the traditional training in the space of what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about civil disagreement, what are some notions of civility, what are arguments for and against tolerance. We did all that work. And then we built a simulation that did something different than what I just described. Since the task in front of us was to get people to have conversations that they're not regularly having, we actually put them into a situation in which they had to adopt totally different roles than they're used to. And we hired a team of people who researched people across the United States to come up with about 5 different profiles across the political spectrum. Far right, so far left, and a few people in between. Not so far right that you've gone alt-right, or so far left that you've gone, somewhere else. I don't know what the equivalent of that is. So I know that term has lost some of the bite that it has before. But there were these roles, and they were built on real people. So these weren't caricatures. These weren't joke personalities. They were built on real people. The simulation then has students wrestle with a horrible incident, the shooting of a young black man. This is the sort of thing that students also wanted to have more conversations about race and about what's happening out in the world. And the way that participants go into the simulation is they're given a role, and then they're given a fake newspaper article describing the situation. And these newspaper articles are built off of what you would get from everything from MSNBC to CNN to Breitbart to the New York Times. And so even the headlines characterize this event completely differently. So they read about this event through a particular lens, embodied in a certain way. They're asked then to write a Facebook post or a Twitter account to sort of anchor where they're at. And the bulk of the simulation has them getting together in a town hall meeting with people who really disagree with them and having a long conversation about whether the police should be wearing body cameras in light of this incident. So we don't just have them engage in an abstract conversation, but we give them a task. At the end of this, you have to make a decision about whether you're coming out and having police wearing body cameras or not. And we give them a little training in how to really embody, a little acting training, to be honest, about how to embody a role that's not yours, particularly for those people who don't have a role that they agree with. We've done this now twice, and by saying twice, I mean we've done it over days a couple of times. And it's been a very productive simulation. And the most productivity that comes with students really taking up the role that they were given and showing how hard it is to have meaningful conversations in that space, but to still try to eke something through it and then we go through a long debrief. That's new, and that just to show you some things that you can do with simulations that you may not be able to do with anything else. When people come to you and say, we're not having these conversations, how can we have these conversations? Sometimes putting on a different role can help. The last part before I turn to today, I found also that using simulations to think about ethics has inspired a growing trend in what my colleague Jen Lerner is calling behavioral ethics. And so what it's inspiring is a line of research to ask questions about how are we reasoning when we're in certain collaborative or not settings. So you know that there's a whole bunch of work here in the behavioral sciences, moral psychology. I'm of the mind, as are many of my colleagues, that moral psychology is not meant to replace ethics. But at the end of the day, it does tell us some things about the way we in fact reason when we're reasoning about ethical things. What we do with that is an open question. We're having a paper published soon that I put together with Jen Lerner and her team that provides some interesting evidence, and like all of this in the behavioral sciences, this is a few studies and there needs to be a lot more. But the evidence seems to suggest, and let me just back this up by saying, most of the research in moral psychology has still been primarily focused with a person reasoning about ethics, like what's the individual do. I told my colleague Jen that's not particularly helpful because many decisions are made in groups. I mean, there's ethics boards, there's school committees, there's the board of whatever it is, that groups make these decisions. So we started to look at that. And one of the things that we're learning through sort of simulated exercises that are in more experimental settings is that when you're in a group setting that you think you're going to be responsible to other people for your decision, you tend to lean more, and you have to make a trade-off between equality and efficiency. What we might hear in ethics is a trade-off between deontology and consequentialism. You lean more deontological in those settings than you otherwise would have. And that's pretty interesting. And it's pretty interesting if you think that, indeed, in many of these situations, you ought to be leaning more deontological. You might say, awesome, full speed ahead. But if you think that there are at least some cases in which consequentialist line of reasoning, like saving the most lives or trying to eke the most good out of a certain amount of resources, should win the day, then the fact that individuals, when in a group and responsible to others for their decisions, lean more deontological is an interesting result that can inform the way that policy decisions are made. Another one in this space that we seem to be uncovering is when groups decide things more consequentialist, they erode trust in them, which is a surprising result. So in other words, if you're looking at a body and this body's making a decision about distributing healthcare resources and it does it in a way that's trying to maximize the good, there's sort of a hit on trust of that group than if the same group was sort of more focused on fairness and an equitable distribution. I don't know what to do with some of those results yet, and again, they're tentative, like anything else. But it suggests a weird dynamic between consequentialist reasoning in some instances and trust in the deliberative bodies that are making those decisions. And I think that these are both bad news for consequentialists in terms of other things that they need to think of when they're thinking about the decisions that are made. I could talk more about that during Q&A if you want, but I can answer any question now before we get into the simulation. Does anyone have a thought on it? Yeah.
Just to sharpen distinctiveness of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Could you differentiate your simulations from what the kind of exercise you go through in a business school class where you get 30 or 40 pages of information about a particular company and the situation that it's in and that just about all the relevant facts you could think of, and probably some irrelevant ones as well. And then you are supposed to put yourself in the position of the CEO and debate within the class about what you should do.
Yep.
Now, that seems to have some of the elements.
Yeah, for sure.
Talking about.
Yeah.
But are you doing something in addition to that that makes it more realistic, more
Realistic, no. That kind of...
to develop the kind of ethical thinking and self-knowledge that you talk about?
Yeah, so I think that things like that are great, right? I mean, I think that that's right in the space of which I'm talking about. What I found in many of those is that the ethical dilemmas, the ethical, are not surfaced. whereas the type of simulations that we're putting together, they're front and center. And I think that that's important, right? Because one of the things we've learned is that if you don't sometimes put people into a simulation when they're forced to make these sorts of trade-offs, they try to brush them under the rug as much as possible. And that still happens. But that sort of thing that happens at school of business is very much in the spirit of this. I think that it's, I mean, one of the things that I would say is that simulations come in many shapes and sizes. And they're always supposed to be key towards certain learning goals. So one of the learning goals that we try to do here is really having people learn about the hard trade-offs that they would make, about how they reason about morality in these sorts of situations, about what they can and can't live with, and about how the group is functioning along the way of doing so. Not clear to me that in school of business has those preoccupations with those kinds of simulations. Could it? Sure. But I find exercises like that to be quite welcome.
It is interesting, though. The business school decided some time ago, maybe about the Enron crisis,
Yeah.
that they should really emphasize ethics
Yep.
much more. And they're very conservative. They're also their business school graduates
Yeah.
were involved in some of these misguided efforts. And so they went, I mean, they not only made several tenure appointments, but they said the very first course, the very first thing you're going to hear as a student is a kind of week on ethics. And the idea that that would sort of implant it in people's minds so that it would come up in other discussions. People would not lose sight of that aspect of decision making. What they found, however, was that there was no very insufficient communication between the different departments in the business school, so that in fact the other parts of the other faculties and
Yep.
departments in the business school went on teaching their thing, which at that time was often diametrically opposed. It was kind of, they had a professor called Jensen who had this agency theory of the only thing we should think about is maximizing profits. And the whole effort to infuse ethics in that way foundered because the ethicists never really had a chance to sit down and talk with the other people in the departments. I'm wondering how you get around that in these cases so that the very good exercises that you're developing aren't sort of forgotten when the people go into the next class and the discussion doesn't bring it up.
Great. So I think these are two distinct points, right? So one is, what kind of learning for ethics can we do with simulations? Another is, how do we make it the case that people engage in ethical reasoning in the professional settings? This is something that we're wrestling with more and more. This is something that an Ethics Pedagogy Fellow, Roni, will be explicitly addressing in one initiative on embedding ethics in CS, and she's going to teach us how to generalize this. This is something that Arthur and I have talked about bringing up more at the Kennedy School. In other words, strategies to bring ethics into these other disciplines so that students don't think that ethics is this like lacquer that you slather on top of everything else, but it emerges from, it emerges within these other disciplines. I think this is a really rich and important topic. I would want to distinguish it from simulations, not because I think that they're intention at all. I mean, I think you can do this with simulations or not. I just think that these are two different conversations, one of which is, you know, what kind of learning do simulated experiences give us? The other one is, how do we make sure that people are thinking about ethics across their professional ambitions? And I would say that there's more and more interest in trying to find ways to have ethics live and be animated. And you'll see a talk on Monday for Roni that explicitly addresses this. Arthur, yeah.
Exercises outside of ethics that some subjects, for instance, are very, very sensitive to finding. So if you do a negotiation,
Mm-hmm.
the scoring system overwhelms anything else that you might tell the students
Yeah.
about what they're supposed to be thinking about. And of course, experimental social psychologists have turned this into a virtue, in that in a kind of cheap, easy way, they think if you prime the subject, somehow that's trapped into something deep in the real world, and so they spend a lot of time intentionally trying to prime their subject. Intentional priming, I'm all for. My question is about unintentional priming, and
Sometimes we exploit it. Sometimes it doesn't show up. Sometimes we try our best to minimize that. Let me tell you about the three. The exploiting is, we exploit it in the campaign simulation that Tomer was the lead on designing. Students will sometimes be frustrated, first with us, but then ultimately with a good debrief with themselves. Insofar as saying, God, with these mechanics, we thought about just winning and getting the most, point. And we're like, well, right, it's a campaign simulation, right? In which that recreates exactly the context that you're in. Sometimes with the Liberty Hospital simulation, it's not so much there. The dice just produce results of how many people, and we're not giving them a metric of measurement or anything like that. They just give them results. And so, you always have some people who will still, you will have some people who will then during a debrief say, well, it was all just a matter of chance because you put this dice in my hand. Now, those are interesting conversations to have about why you felt that when in the real world you don't think that, even though there's really the rolling of a dice to some extent. The challenge with any more robust simulation is finding a way to bring randomness in, which I think is important for decisions under uncertainty, in a way that students won't just dwell on in the wrong ways. And I don't have the recipe for that. It's one of the things that we try to do with a lot of play testing, is what I would describe. We're not going through a whole corruption simulation today. We're doing something a little different, and that's just because, confessionally, I'm not there yet with the corruption simulation. And I at least want to explain why, because I think in a sense it answers your question. I've been designing a series of simulations that increase in complexity, that tries to push students more and more into some hard spaces. And the most simplest one, which some of you have already experienced, is a Liberty Hospital simulation, is what I call it. And you're just an ethics board of a hospital, and it's a terrible day in the city. There's been a terrorist attack. And the fiction is an ethics board really wouldn't be the ones finally making these decisions, but students have no problem sort of taking on that role. And you have to make hard trade-offs. This person says, don't save me. Do you nevertheless try to save them? Here's this precious resource, oxygen. Do you take it from some to give it more? You get the idea. You roll dice to find the result. All right, all that's doing is getting to see where people will come down when they have to make a hard trade-off. The campaign simulation then adds a little bit more wrinkles in that there's some, there's really a question, is this candidate as good as they say that they are? And so now you have to sort of live and absorb that as well. All right. The next one, which is, some of you saw at the beginning of this year, is what I call it the West Wing Season 8, which is your advisors for the president. And you're making some really hard trade-offs here. And now you have to think about your own position in an organization, and you have to also think about whether the administration is going to survive its decisions. The most useful way to do some of this complexity is through game components. This is speaking to Arthur's points, right? You have a metric, I'm here in the administration, I'm so forth. The trick is doing it in a way where students recognize that those are just reflections of something real that would be going on versus it's just a game. That's where playtesting comes in. The corruption simulation that I'm working on is the most challenging. And it's the most challenging because it came again from student feedback saying, we want a simulation that puts us into a space that many of us have experienced. And so I'll tell you what the simulation is to give you a sense of what that space is. The students will be playing the fictional role of leaders in an arm of a very successful NGO. It's been very successful in the past. And this new initiative of it is to deliver educational resources to young girls and women in a fictional country setting. This is some of the, I built this off of what some students have actually done. But in this setting, there's just a lot of hard decisions that have to be made, and the organization has a lot of hard decisions going on. So in the setting, for instance, the team would have to make a decision like the following. These young girls will be going to a school that could be a target. The local tribes will be more than happy to protect the school, but you have good reason to believe that they're not going to be very good at it. A group that would be very good at it is a group of mercenaries who are more than happy to be paid, and they'll do a phenomenal job. But they've actually done some really terrible things in the past. So do you go with the local tribes, or do you go with the mercenaries? That's the sort of decisions that people make. Along the way in the simulation, students will find out that the head of their organization has been entirely cooking the books. to get more money. And just before a big chance to get more money for their particular initiative comes, they will have to make a decision about whether to go public with this information or not. To do, so what I'm trying to do along the way is to track a metric that measures how corrupt your efforts are becoming in terms of, in a general way of defining, like aligning yourself with shady individuals, covering up these sorts of things. And there's a way, and what I haven't found yet is a way to do this that doesn't go too gamey or not gamey enough. And this is where I think that this is where just good old-fashioned, what I call play testing happens. Keep putting it in front of a bunch of people and figure out what that sweet spot is. And then have answers to the people who are going to go in one way or the other. So I hope that's sort of an answer. Any other questions I can answer before we get into today's simulation, before we get a sense of what this looks like, or about simulations in general? What I'm hoping is at the end of this, you think about ways that you would want to insert some simulated learning experiences into your own work. I've just described the sort of range of simulations that we do to. The last thing that I want to say before we give you the one that we're going to be working on, I want to make sure that I give you time for it. Yes, good. Is this. Active learning exercises like the ones I'm talking about have become very popular. Their mere popularity is not enough to justify them. I think that they are justifiable for lots of reasons. But the fact that they're popular and justifiable means that it would be good to be able to produce them as well as one can. What I have found is that scaling can be a challenge. And so what I'm doing today is giving you an example of how to scale one thing that I've done. And it's just a work in progress. So if you sniff around the internets, you'll find that I gave a TED Talk a few years ago that TED just recently decided to showcase for a week, irresistibly called How I Use Dungeons and Dragons to Teach Ethics. Needless to say, I got a lot of hits, and I got a lot of weird emails. I didn't even know that TED had done this until I got some strange emails showing up in my inbox, like, can I buy your game? And I'm like, I'd love to sell it to you. I have no idea what you're talking about, but if I had built one. Some years ago when I first got into the space, I was asked to design a leadership simulation for an executive education course at the Kennedy School. And it was Elaine K. Mark, who had worked for the Clinton administration, had been at the Kennedy School for many years, who tasked me with this. And she said, Chris, here's the challenge. We're going to be running the simulation for 60, 70, 80 people a couple of times a year. These are going to be leaders from all across the world. I want to put them into a pandemic crisis simulation that gives them leadership skills, has them think about ethics. Here's the task. I don't want the simulation to be anything that any of them have had any experience dealing with for a real pandemic, and I don't want it to ever be the case that they would have experience with it. She wanted me to come up with something fictional enough so that it really would push people into a space where they didn't know what to do, their expertise was not helpful. All right, so Arthur knows where this is going. I said, great, Elaine. I said, how about we give them a zombie pandemic? You know, let's just give them a zombie thing. Elaine, to her credit, was like, that's fantastic, Chris. I love the idea. Brilliant. Nowadays, when I rolled out this zombie pandemic for a lot of groups, I've rolled out at the School of Business for the Bertelsmann Corporation, you know. I feel that if I can convince German businessmen to spend a lot of time thinking about, like, the seriousness of zombies, I'm all set. The thing of the matter is, you know, I do point to, somewhat laughably, but also maybe this is an ethical conversation for a different time, the Department of Defense has a zombie plan in place. So our tax dollars have been used for this to be reflected upon. The point is that zombies do a great job of putting people into a very awkward space fast. It models very nicely real-world pandemics, and people get into it in a way that I never could have imagined you getting into. The simulation I designed, though, was a simulation that required a team of people over the course of a day working with individual tables. The benefit of this kind of simulation was here'd be a group of people. They would be running a fictional country. This simulation manager, as I called them, would come to them and drop a little pebble. Here's an incident that's happened. The team sort of loses its mind, comes up with all these different strategies on, hey, we were just talking about our paper. This is Tomer. Comes up with all these different strategies on how to, like, adopt this, and then the simulation manager comes to them and says, what do you do? They give them their answer, you roll some dice, and they narrate what happens next. The benefit of this kind of a simulation is that students, participants, can come up with anything that they want. They'll never say, you railroaded me into a certain decision, because they were able to generate it, and you have someone there who can improvisationally respond to anything that they come up with. It has proven to be an extremely, extremely effective kind of simulation because students can't hide behind, I only had these choices. If you just gave me more choices, it would be much. The problem is that it's very hard to scale because it is labor intensive. So I took that simulation and I cut it in half. And one half of it is a global negotiation. And I ran it for the Safra Center a few years ago, and I've run it for the MPP course at the Kennedy School. And it's nice. It's a nice, clean sort of thing you can do. But I had a real problem trying to do that first part where you're not in a global negotiation. You're just working with a group of people in a fictional country, managing hard problems that emerge during this crisis, making decisions and living with them. I said, how do you do this? I was forced to scale this, I was asked to scale this, and it forced me to think about it. During orientation at the Kennedy School for all the incoming MPP students, they're like, can you do something in this space? People love the simulation. It's a very popular simulation. But here's the task, they're like. It's going to have to be run simultaneously for 240 people in a whole bunch of different rooms and more or less runs it on its own. And then you're going to have to come back together and debrief it. So we can't do negotiation or anything like that. And I obviously don't have a staff that can go room by room and group by group. So what I'm going to give you today is an example of how I tried to scale it for that. The cost is you are railroaded a little bit. But you do get something, I think, that scales better. And the thing that I want to just point to here is scaling these sorts of moral simulations, if you want to call them that, could be profoundly effective if we ever want to move them online or we want to have them reach a wider audience. And so I'm spending a lot of my time for Ethics Pedagogy Week thinking about the least I have to give up to scale these in a way that I think could reach wider audiences. And that's what I want to sort of give you a sense of today, is what a scaled version of this looks like, just to get your hands dirty a little bit in making these decisions, and then we'll debrief it a little bit. So that's what we're going to do for about an hour, and we'll talk about it a little bit, and then we'll go from there. So I need you to, you've all spread yourselves out wonderfully, but I need you to now gather into tables of around 5, if you will, closer to the front if possible. But this will be your team. So just gather yourselves into groups of 5, please. Yeah, let me just give me 1 second here, yeah. Not yet. Yep. Also drink coffee, eat lots of pastries. We got a nice table here. We have 4 here? Is that 4 or 5? Just 4? 5. All right. How many are going to be here ultimately? 4, you think? Is that 4? Okay. How are you doing? So what you're going to be doing is very quickly building up a country from the ground up. And this sheet is meant, again, it's a scaling example of helping people through that as straightforwardly as possible. Michael, would you pass out the sheets? We're going to put one of these into each of your hands, but keep in mind that there's only going to be one country that emerges table by table. So this is going to be a fictional country, this is going to be a fictional country, and that one back there is going to be a fictional country. Oh, okay. Feel better. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is follow the instructions and together, collaboratively, build a country over the next couple of minutes. Use your sheets as guidance. The instructions, I hope, are mostly clear on how to do this, but I'm here for questions along the way. I'll come around, but I'm going to let you start doing this group by group. Yeah. Yep. Yep. You roll twice and you add 1. 3, 4, 5, 6. Nine. Your Bachland, is that? Love it. Did you roll your dice for the group? Yep. Great. Less. How are you doing? I talked a little bit about our paper.
That's nice. It's great. I was just met with Tariq Masood.
Mm-hmm.
I told him about a paper. He didn't know about it, so that was good. I'm just spreading the word.
That's great. Guys, for this, guys, I'm going to, this is just me going around with tables. So can I kill this for this?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, great.
It's Chris, right?
Yes, yeah.
So when you're about to go into what you want recorded as substance, if you can just flick it on again.
I'll do it. Okay, so let me, if I can have your attention up here just for a second. I want to, part of doing this is to sort of jump outside of it along the way to talk about the teaching stuff. So again, the framing this, the challenge was built a really nice simulation in which simulation managers were really proximate to tables for the course of a day and did a lot of this work with them. Trying now to scale it in a way where I can deliver it to hundreds of people across a school and have it mostly run on its own. Part of what you're doing right now is, of course, just making some basic decisions about a fictional country. But partly what you're doing is also figuring each other out a little bit. And again, in a setting in which students maybe don't know each other at all, this is really interesting. So you're getting to know each other, again, just a little bit, but like you're thinking to yourself, well, this person wanted to go all in on military, or this person cared only about institutions, and but again, but there's something interesting behind this, which is you're starting to figure out your group dynamics, right? You're starting to figure out how you approach these things, how you think, and that's not nothing. It's not everything. It's not the sort of thing that would emerge, if we did this, for hours and hours, that would be different. But these basic decisions do that, where they teach you a little bit about yourselves, and they give you some just rudimentary but crucial buy-in. Rather than just handing you a country, saying this is your country, you already own this country a little bit. You just built it up yourself and just made commitments about what matters and what doesn't and how to distribute your points. And so the point here is that at a level of scale, even small activities like this, which are only around 10 minutes or so, can happen relatively straightforwardly. You have the instructions, you have the thing. I do have to explain what 2d6 is. I've learned this in the past. I think it is I'm so oriented around games that I keep forgetting that some people look at 2d6 and are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. You reminded me of that, and I appreciate it. I need to spell that a little bit more. But roughly, you can follow the instructions and get your country here. So just very quickly, can I hear country names? What's your country name? Rainland. Okay, here? Bachland, and back there? Oh! And that's interesting. Yeah. The country that shall not be named, right? Well, we'll leave it at that. Yeah, I think you probably want to come up with one in the next minute or so as we go into it. All right. Right. I've seen it. People bring up their phones, random name generators. All right. So what we're going to do is go through. Just hold on one second on that. Go through the first scenario. So now the thought is people have this, and I've already framed this. And at scale, the thought is you're going to be given a scenario. And the scenario is going to be, you want to each read it yourself. And you're going to be given around 10 minutes or so to make a decision. What we're also doing at the same time is giving you the results sheet. And this is something that is a scale thing. I'm not going to have people don't roll the dice to determine results. But I found that folks do glob onto this a little bit better when they have the possible branches of the tree and the results that would happen in front of them. So I want to just put that out in front of you this time. There's an interesting conversation to have about whether this results should come out at the beginning of the scenario, or you just surprise people with it at the end. But I want to try it with both of them in hand. So first you're going to be given the scenario, and then you're going to be given the range of possible results based on your decision. So let's get those out now. Thanks. Okay, so all three groups decided no ban. So what you need to do now is designate one person. So what you're going to be doing is rolling the dice, adding those two die together, and adding your military score to get a result. So whoever wants to roll the dice, please roll the dice. Add your military rating, and that gives you your result. Oh. What did you get? All right. Okay, can I have your attention here for a sec? So just two things on this that I want to point to. The first is the probability distribution is, as you probably figured out, is, here's the number and everything goes successfully no matter what you did in a sense. Here's a number where things don't go so well, and then there's this middle ground where things go okay, but it comes at some cost. That's a typical distribution. What I want to do now is give you scenario 2. I'm going to give you this one without having the results in your hand, right? And then what I want to do is step outside of that, and you tell me what you think is better for the learning. So this one was, we have the results, we know what we're leaning on, we have all that. Let me give you scenario 2 where that's not in play. And I'd be really curious to hear your feedback on what you think is better for the learning. So scenario 2. I never really gave you, so when I run this for the students, I just show a picture of a zombie and talk about a few of these things. But roughly, I want you to imagine that this exploded fairly quickly. Reports in several cities of people acting violently and being non-responsive to any sorts of reason. infection seems to spread through bite or claw attack or these sorts of things. And the weirdness of it, right? The fact that otherwise normal people suddenly descend into this is freaking people out. I think that helps contextualize this scenario a little bit. People really want to know who's infected and who's not, and some do take matters into their own hands as this technology is distributed. You, by the way, are the sort of advisors to the situation who get to make final decisions on this and advise the president and/or whoever you think would be in charge in a situation like this. Yeah. That's a great question. I had long conversations about this. Some are slow and some are fast. And if that's right. Depends on how fast they were before they were infected. I like that answer. That's a great one. So I'm going to ask you to please take a vote or arrive at a decision any other way that you see fit on a course of action. One for me. Okay, did everyone make a decision? Are you going public and demanding a ban or no? Yes, or we are. Are you going public, demanding a ban? Yeah. Are you going public, sort of demanding a ban or no? Okay. So results. Let's put one of those into everyone's hands. It'll be the same sort of thing. At the top of the sheet, you'll see what attribute to add to your dice roll to determine the result. So once you get those sheets in your hand, make that die roll and figure out what happened. Can I have that one, Michael? Thanks. Yeah, please, yeah. I think that should be great. Thank you.
Well, not waste.
Well, no, yeah. Economy.
Well, it seems like the bad result is better for us.
How do you do? Okay. Okay, so everyone got the results? Quick conversation, and then we'll go into the third one. Pros and cons regarding results in hand as you deliberate versus results revealed after you deliberate. What are your thoughts? Who wants to start us off? Okay, so you like the idea of, look, here's how we're thinking about this, but we just don't know what's going to happen until we get it. Okay. Come on.
I like not having the result. I also like delivering only the result that seems possible.
Okay.
And one of the main reasons is we were discussing a lot of other possible implications of our decision. We didn't end up being relevant.
Yep.
Now that we see
Yep.
results. And that was really important in our decision.
Yep.
But by giving us the result, we're more narrowly focused on these particular.
Yep. So in terms of the first one, I mean, I hear the argument of no results in hand so that you don't focus on these. In terms of just delivering the result of the role, harder when you're scaling the way I'm thinking, right? So that may be a trade-off.
Yeah, except that you're doing this by paper, which is like very 19th century. Presumably, we can do all this online.
You absolutely could do all this online. Yeah. I mean, and there's a move to make this online. Yeah.
And in fact, one way of scaling it up without losing the personal touch, let's combine all the hot trendy things. Why can't you have an AI program that does personalization?
Someone wants to fund it, I'm all on board. Totally on board with that. Did anyone? So I'm hearing two of keep the results out of hand with sort of an addendum, and in fact, just get when you do reveal the results, just reveal the result that you got. Anyone like the results in front of them at the start? No, that's fine. I'll tell you the reason I sometimes do it is because some students are paralyzed when you give them these scenarios. Others feel cheated when you give them the results saying, oh, we weren't thinking about this, we were thinking about something else, and there's a sense of betrayal. And I'm just pointing out as a, yeah.
If there are, let's say, 4 or 5 rounds,
Yeah.
giving the results on the first one could give people a sense of what the game is like.
I see.
And then
Nice. Okay.
So I think it worked very nicely with us.
Yep.
We saw the results first time,
Mhm.
and okay, now we're grown-ups. We now know what Chris is up to, but it's better to not have the results going forward.
Okay. so, so right. So the last thing I'll point to, and then we'll get into scenario number 3 is, so the one thing I have not done on this intentionally is, and this is to speak to another concern that Arthur and others have raised, is I could have developed, and Tomer, thinks in this space well too, we could have developed an ongoing metric that sort of gives you a numerical or otherwise interesting verdict on where you're at based on the results of these things, like the health of the country or that sort of thing. But instead, I'm relying on you to sort of narrate what's happening in your country case by case. Jess, I sort of heard you doing this already. You're like, we should keep in mind that we're coming into this one already having had this loss. And so there's a trade-off there too. On the one hand, it's sort of nice to have some metric, but it is more gamey. But you do want students to, these aren't isolated cases. This is a thing that's happening. And so after we go through scenario 3, I'm going to ask you to share your feedback about the cost of that trade-off or not. But right now, just sort of leaning it on you. There's no numerical measure of how your country is doing, but you have a story about the decisions you made and the consequences of those decisions. Scenario 3. So no results going forward by democratic vote. think I have time for one more. I'm not going to be able to do two more. What's that? We're not going to do 5. No, I think I have time for one more. I think I can get away with 4 if we do it quickly. Yeah. So you're getting results, is that right? Yeah, great. Okay. Do you mind if I have just one? Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask you to make a decision, and let's see. I want to hear the decisions first. So, what did you decide? Do you invest? What did you decide? I would vote soon. What did you decide? Invest, invest. All right. So, invest, invest.
We need to wash our hands afterwards.
Can you send out the results? So do not invest, invest, invest. Here we have. Can I just tell you, though, I love this moment. Like, you were agonizing. You're like, I don't want to be the one to make this decision. That's what this does. Though that's what this does. Yeah, exactly, exactly. It should be at the top of the sheet, health. Moral hazard, yeah. How'd it go for you for that role? You're good at rolling? So where did you land on this? 10 plus, and you approve the investment, is that right? Okay.
Okay, so we think the choice was too narrow because a real government in this situation would have more options.
So tell me some of the options you want. So keep in mind we want to force some decision. What should it be? Yeah, yeah.
I understand, but we could ban it.
Uh-huh.
We also have the same egalitarian outcome. So the only reason we approved it was, well, basically we don't want this kind of class strife, right? But there's other ways of preventing class strife.
Yeah.
By banning it entirely, which would have other kind of consequences. So unlike the other ones,
So maybe I think
realistic choices, this seems like an honest.
so I think maybe a way. So I want to do a dirty hands one with this. Maybe the way around that is to say, if you banned it, you will not eliminate the problem that the rich can still have access to it. Yeah, you would just make it even harder for anyone else to get it. You could do status quo, or you could subsidize. You know. Yeah, yeah. There'll be a black market. Yeah. All right, we have time for one more. So let's get this one out into everyone's hands. Scenario 4.
Yeah, I have no idea whether we have a country left.
Yeah. Right. See, that sounds. See, that's just Happy Tuesday morning. You know, this is what I do. People. That's right. So you ran the software? Are you running the software or not running the software? Running the software or not running the software? Running it? Where do the rest of you stand on this? I'm coming around for quick decisions. No. And here, yes or no? All right, results, please. Yeah. Roll the die and find out the result. Oh, no. Michael, there seems to be blank pages in these. This is a new element. You get to write your own results. Do you need a result sheet, or is that, do we have results over there? All right, I unfortunately have to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes and head off. So I just want to take a step outside of it. We could do more scenarios. I had an extra one. We'll pause here, though. Now, it gives you a good idea. This was meant to show you an experimentation in scaling for something that was very successful when done with much more proximity. But you can see how, there are some trade-offs, but you can see how some interesting developments nevertheless occur in this space. You're with a group of people. You're forced to make hard decisions. You learn about each other. Sometimes you yourself, like we hear, you're like, I don't want to be the one making this decision. You're asking people to step outside, like, what's the state of our country right now? So I think that this has promise, and it is the sort of thing that I believe you can put online eventually. It comes at some costs, as I mentioned. That one of those costs is I am forcing decisions, and there's nothing quite like taking ownership over decisions that you entirely originated on your own. But one thing that I would do during a debrief, and we're not having a debrief now, is really, you can imagine if a lot of people do this, you bring them all together, you have a debrief, you start talking about the decisions that were made. People will quickly realize that folks approach this much differently. There's not like unanimity at all at a certain level. Like when I run this for 250 students or so, it's not as if 90% choose option A over B most of the time. You get something like 60 to 70% on one side, but a healthy minority on the other each time. And you can have conversations about how past results were infecting your thinking going forward. Like, gosh, we messed up these past two, or at least things didn't come our way. Is that changing things? And so I give this to you today as sort of new work that we're doing in this space because I do have an interest of building these kinds of simulations into larger spaces where we can sort of present it to bigger groups. And I think the effort was an effort to address some of Arthur's concerns we talked about before, to make it a little less gamey, and therefore to have it have a bit more bite. But to also have levers to pull if you do want to add like different components to it. So I got a minute or two for some last thoughts. Yeah?
I'm just wondering when this exercise is over.
Yep.
What good has been done for the students?
Great. Yep.
They have certainly had some taste of how difficult decisions can be in government, and maybe they feel that their result came out better, in the long run. Although the ends don't necessarily justify the means, so you're still not sure. I'm just wondering whether you come out of this feeling, it's all terribly complicated, and it's been fun to put ourselves in the shoes of government leaders, but
So I,
In the end, doesn't this leave you with a feeling, well, you could try your hardest, but these decisions are just too hard, and in the end, what it teaches me is, you know, follow your gut instincts, and these things not to help you get out of this. It's all going to be
yeah, so let me,
murky in the end.
Brian, did you want to speak to this? Because I saw your hand jump up.
Yeah, I would just,
Just for recording.
all I'm going to say is I'd encourage you to stay for the afternoon talk that I'm giving because it's on exactly this question.
Yeah. And what I'll say in
That's a-
yeah,
that's
so
a
that's
shameless
great.
plug. I'm sorry.
Advertisement. But in my minute, I'll simply say I really feel, and this is something I just have to sort of state. We're not going through, and you know, I always an open invitation to see me doing these debriefs. A lot of this depends on what happens in that debrief. You know, and that debrief is not a 10-minute debrief. Usually, it's an hour or two. So some of that exasperation comes out. But there's a lot of learning when students realize what things they did consider and didn't consider in the moment when they're listening to other people. And them sort of then having a richer conversation about, oh, you know, this wasn't even on our radar. It should have been. Why wasn't it on our radar? Oh, here's an argument that someone offered in our group about why to do this. That's a pretty good argument. In other words, they leave this hungry, curious, interested, recognizing the difficulty of these things, but they don't collapse into despair, you know. At least my experience has been they absolutely don't collapse into despair, but they rather do recognize how hard these decisions are, but how much progress can be made on them. I will add, I don't mind them seeing that it's hard because that's part of the learning that I want to do with this. Each simulation, I think, has a good target audience. This simulation, one of its target audience is MPP students at the Kennedy School who think that government decisions are super easy, moral truths are obvious, there's never trade-offs that have to be made. And so putting them a little bit into the space of realizing things actually are harder than that without them collapsing into despair, I think is a useful way. This comes at the beginning of the semester to sort of key them up to more substantial learning along the way. Anyways,
All that, but I think at the end of the day, you've also got to leave them with the feeling that discussions of moral issues are worth having.
I don't think anyone leaves without thinking that.
There are a lot of moral relatives to this around who just feel,
Oh,
you know.
okay, fair enough, but that's not a problem with the simulation. I mean, people can leave an entire ethics class becoming a moral relativist, right? I mean, we should, I think, recognize that relativism, right, is present amongst some students. But at the same time, encouraging a sort of rich conversation over real issues that they had to make decisions of need not, nor should it collapse into relativism. You know, I mean, that's you know, it would be to me weird if students left thinking that. I've never experienced students coming up to me afterwards saying, gosh, after going through the simulation, I think that anything goes, you know. I mean, that's anecdotal, but I mean, it has some bite, yeah.
Someone might just say, oh, I have to do my probability distributions better, which would be the wrong shot.
Right.
Not that that's a mistake, but that's so I think the value of it, you get their attention. The value of this exercise depends, though, entirely on the quality, the nature of the debrief.
Yep.
And then there's the question of scale, right? So you doing debrief, you haven't figured out, here's a technological problem, we haven't figured out how to phone you yet, right? So when we think of scaling this, the exercise scale, you know, political philosophy teachers don't scale very well. So how do you put this in the hands of lots of people
Great, great.
without really having sophisticated teaching materials about the debrief?
I have to apologize that I must run after this, and I don't want to, but I will say this. We've tried this with the online course we're doing. So one thing that I've done is done a generic debrief where it's not interactive with students because they're all over the world. But what it does is it goes case by case, and it teases out all the different moral dimensions to this and ways that you can do it. And I think that something like that is a good stepping stone. You can put that into anyone's lap. Here is a political philosopher, an ethicist, showing you how they're reasoning through these things. It doesn't have the nice sweet spot of like being able to call on people, but it does have the like, look, there's a lot here. Let us show you what's going on here. Yeah. 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 I feel comfortable leaving this in the hands of my friend and colleague Tomer, who is very much in the space as well, and I feel can pick up the conversation when I have to go, and I apologize, but I do have an appointment that I have to get to. But I want to just appreciate your, your participation in this exercise, and it is built on feedback that I've gotten from the past, and I think that we're continuing to make progress going forward. And that's part of what this week is about, is just showing us, making progress going forward on this. So thank you very much. Thank you.
And as Chris runs, we are not done.
Give this to me later.
Yep. We're not done for the day, so this concludes part 1, but there's a very exciting part 2 for the day, which Brian is going to lead us through, and we're going to get to a lot of these same questions. And Brian's got a really great presentation built around some of these issues of teaching ethics in the classroom, use of metaphor, aesthetics. It's got a lot of really great stuff in it, so please stay for the 1 o'clock presentation here. But in the meantime, we can continue this conversation and have lunch. So there's lunch just outside the door here. The desserts and coffee will stay put. You can eat in here. You can also take a break, but we hope you stick around and debrief. Thanks.